This is the Comics Alternative, episode 293. Reviews of A Contract with God, Curator's Collection, Egg Cream, number 1, and Hey Kids Comics, numbers 1 and 2. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sturge. And we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's episode, Sturge and I are going to discuss 3 titles. We're going to begin with A Contract with God, Curator's Collection, obviously by Will Eisner, but edited and designed by John Lind. After that, we're going to look at Liz Suburbia's Egg Cream, number 1. And then we're going to wrap up by looking at the first 2 issues of Howard Chaykin's Hey Kids Comics. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by those incredible folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you're going to find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
Yeah, just for example, one of the books we're talking about today, the Contract with God Curator's Collection, is available for 40% off, which is a good chunk of change because it's a large and expensive book. Mm-hmm. Also, the Hey Kids Comics number 4 is being solicited also for 40% off, so that's only $239 cover price.
You know, you really can't beat the incredible prices at Discount Comic Book Service. If for no other reason, discount is in their name. That's dcbservice.com. You gotta go there. It's imperative for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Sounds good.
Well, speaking of the two guys with PhDs, those listening to the show are probably wondering, who the hell is this Sturge guy? And what's he doing talking with Derek? Well, for those of you who have been following the Comics Alternative, you know that lately, after my original co-host Andy Kunka stepped down early this year, he just didn't have the time anymore for the podcast, I got Paul Lai, who had been helping out quite a bit and filling in on the regular review shows whenever we needed him, but he was also one of the co-hosts of the Young Reader series. So he was my co-host for the weekly show, but he has had some life changes over the past month, and he had told me and Gwen Tarbox, the other co-host of the Young Reader show, that he really couldn't work with us on a regular basis consistently anymore. Now, Paul will be back every now and again in one form or another, so it's not that he's leaving the Comics Alternative. It's just his regular co-hosting duties he's had to put aside for now. So I thought, okay, God, who am I going to find as another co-host? And, you know, given that our tagline from the beginning has been two guys with PhDs, it was kind of baked in that we needed to find someone else who had a PhD, who had experience with comic studies, and also had a love of comics. And I immediately thought of Stergios Botzakis. Sturge, you're someone who I think has been listening to us almost from the very beginning. And I would see you and continue to see you every year at Heroes Con, and I thought he would be perfect. I'm glad that you accepted, and I want everyone to welcome on board Stergios Botzakis.
Well, thank you for having me, Derek. I'm very happy and proud, and I have a lot to live up to, and I will do my best. My name is Stergios Botzakis. I'm a professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I'm a literacy professor. I'm actually in literacy education. I work mostly with people that are going to be teachers or people that are teachers, middle and high school. But obviously I have a love of comics, and I've incorporated that into looking at alternate ways to engage people in literacy. And I pitch a lot of comics. I talk a lot about graphic novels throughout my courses. And I've been reading comics for a very long time. And it's one of those things that you become a Patreon to a podcast, and then one day they ask you to be a co-host. It's one day your dreams can come true, kids.
There you go. So there's a ray of hope for all listeners out there. And, you mentioned, Sturge, that you work in literacy studies. And that was a big draw, because that's something that I really don't have any experience in. My background is, I guess, English studies, broadly speaking, but in particular, literary studies and comic studies. So your approach in some ways is going to be a little different from mine. And I think that would bring a more well-roundedness to the kind of things that we do.
Sure. I'm going to try my best to sound smart, because I do have a PhD, so that should help me.
Yeah, I've given up trying to sound smart. Just trying to sound semi-coherent is what I shoot for.
Hey, I've got 2 little kids at home, so semi-coherent, that's a win every day.
Yeah. Again, Sturge, welcome, and I am very glad and honored that you are the new co-host of the Comics Alternative.
Well, thank you so much, Derek. I'm very glad and proud, and like I said, I'm just raring to go.
Well, okay, now that you're raring, let's go ahead and begin with this week's discussion. And we're going to start off with actually something quite different for us on the Comics Alternative. This is a Contract with God Curators collection. This was edited and designed by John Lind, and it came out back in June from Dark Horse and Kitchen Sink Press. And, as we mentioned during the sponsor bit, Sturge, this is a rather chunky text, especially in terms of the price. I think that the retail was $195. Mm-hmm. So right there, I think that's the most expensive book we've ever discussed on the weekly review show. But this is also a new first for us, because we have never looked at one of these kind of texts before. And what I mean by that is, how IDW does the artist editions, and mm-hmm. other publishers do things that are similar. I can't remember what DC calls its line.
I'm not sure. I don't remember that.
But yeah, there are other publishers who do similar things. This is very much like those IDW artist editions. And we've never discussed anything like this before. So one of the things that Sturge, you and I can mull over is not only the narrative of A Contract with God, but also what this particular edition, the Curators collection, has to offer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for the record, DC Legends Artifact Edition. That's what they call them.
Okay. Yep. There you go. See? A great researcher at the drop of a hat. You're right there with the answers.
My Google foot is strong.
So yeah, this is a really nice book or books. Now, you and I both have PDF versions of this. I should mention also that I went ahead and shelled out for a hard copy of Contract with God Curators collection. And it's beautiful. Now, I'm not holding this and thumbing through it as we discuss this book, because it's just big and it's heavy and it would be awkward for me to do. So I'm going to be looking at and referring to the PDF as we go along. Mm. But I can tell you, Sturge, that, the hard copy, the hardcover of this collection comes in a really nice slipcase, and there are 2 volumes. The first volume is A Contract with God pencils, and the second is A Contract with God inks. So, and there are differences in the story between these 2 volumes, and we can talk about that. But mm-hmm. also peppered throughout both of these editions are a variety of, essays and remembrances from a variety of different artists and creators. So, for instance, we do get in each volume an essay from John Lind as well as from Dennis Kitchen. But we also get, and I think it's in the Inks volume number 2, kind of a historical overview of Eisner by Dave Gibbons. We also get appreciations by such creators as Jeff Smith, Nate Powell, Sergios Aragonis, and Paul Levitz. So this is not just the pencils and inks of A Contract with God, but this also has other valuable material as well.
Yeah, it was one of the things I was struck by is those little essays and little tributes, actually. I mean, it's like a who's who of comics history. I mean, going back to some old days to a lot of contemporary creators, too. So I was impressed by one of the things that struck me. I can't remember exactly which episode I can't remember who said it, but I think it was during that episode where Neal Adams was on the podcast, that he was pretty harsh on Eisner from what I remember, at least his stories. And one of the things that struck me, I think he was calling it like singer knockoffs or something like that is what I remember. And to me, it was kind of good to see a lot of other
Was that when
voices.
I had him on for We Spoke Out?
That's what it was. That was the episode I'm thinking about.
Okay.
And I just remember him being pretty harsh on Eisner's, not his artwork, but really the stories. And so to me, it was, I was kind of heartened to read through because I remember liking the stories more well than that, and seeing all these big name folks highlighting just the importance of the book and what it did for them kind of put it back in context for me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I have done kind of like you. I've read A Contract with God multiple times, and I've, even devoted quite a bit of scholarship to, I guess, A Contract with God in particular, but also Will Eisner in a broader sense. Although it had been a while since I had come back to A Contract with God, so it was really good to look through these 2 volumes and to not only refresh myself of A Contract with God and then remind myself how incredible these stories are, but also to see some of the differences in the original conception that we get, let's say, with the Pencils volume, and then how that is in certain ways kind of slightly different from the finished Contract with God, which is more in line with volume 2, the inks. Yeah.
And one of the things that kind of impressed me too is just the level. I mean, I've seen lots of different versions of pencils, and some people it's very scratchy and ill-defined. And these pencils are, I think they could almost stand up by themselves as just artwork in a typical graphic novel. I mean, they have a lot of power to them. I'm impressed with his lines, his shading, and just in the pencil forms are kind of amazing. And I love seeing the behind the scenes stuff. I mean, I don't have any artist editions or anything like that, but I've coveted them, and I've seen other people's. And I mean, one of the things I like is kind of like the inside baseball look, and like seeing the tape on the page, and seeing how things are pasted together, seeing kind of how like the physical object is held together. That's always amazing to me, to kind of look at all the stuff that's not on the comics page, but it's around there, telling you where to cut, where to trim. All that stuff is, I don't know. I'm just fascinated by looking at it. It's almost like a little piece of alchemy or something for me. It's like this magical thing that I see the finished form, but seeing the original form is, I don't know, there's an energy to it I really enjoy.
So you're a process junkie.
I know. I never would have pegged myself for that, but apparently I am.
Yeah, you mentioned the artist editions. I don't have many. In fact, I only have 2 IDW artist editions, and curiously enough, both of them are the Eisner volumes. The Spirit one, and then I guess the second artist edition that they did with the Spirit. So those are the only 2 that I have. But actually, Mike Cobry, who is my co-host for the On Location show at Heroes every month, has a number of those artist editions, definitely more than I do. And
right.
I would love to get them, like you said. Yeah, I covet them. It's just they're so damn expensive. Although, with Eisner, I will shell out some.
See, you're the Eisner junkie.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, an Eisner junkie. But yeah, now we were mentioning some of the essays in these two volumes. Now, Dave Gibbons's essay appears in volume 2, and I think for all practical purposes, it's like an intro. And these are brand new essays, by the way. They do reprint some earlier introductions that had appeared in previous volumes of A Contract with God. So, for instance, Will Eisner's introduction to a later volume of A Contract with God, or a later edition. But some of these essays by Gibbons, Kitchen, and Lind are brand new. And Gibbons's, for all practical purposes, is a historical overview. So it appears in volume 2, Inks. So if you didn't know much of anything about Will Eisner, if you read Dave Gibbons's essay, and it's a few pages long, it's not that long at all, you get a sense of who he was and the basic trajectory of his career.
Yeah, and that was good for me to kind of get a little more context too. I mean, I've delved around in comic book history here and there, and it's kind of amazing just how much at the front end of it he was, and how it's one of those things. It's kind of like watching an old movie nowadays when you're not impressed with it, because it's like you've seen all the tricks and you've seen all the kind of conventions, and you don't remember that the conventions were created by somebody, and they at one point were cutting edge. And just to see kind of how involved with the business he was, on the business end, on the artistic end. To me, that was one of the major draws about this book. It was just reading through those things where, I don't know, it did me good to kind of be refreshed about just what it was that he'd done.
I think that of all the original essays, short and long, that appear in the Curator's collection, the one that I'm most impressed with appears in volume 1, Pencils, and it's by Dennis Kitchen. His essay in volume 2 is good as well, but I think the one in the first volume is invaluable, because what Dennis does, and we've had Dennis on the show a few times, great guy, and in fact, the last time I was talking with him, I think an interview for Will Eisner Week, he had talked a little bit about the Curator's collection and was telling us what we can anticipate in it. But and he mentioned some of these things that appear in volume 1, Pencils, in his essay. The reason I like this so much is that Dennis points out some of the things that we see in the Pencils version of A Contract with God that didn't make it into the final cut, so to speak, of the actual book, A Contract with God. One of the things that he points out is that he discovered, by accident in fact, that in the first story, A Contract with God, the title piece, that, in the finished A Contract with God, we never do see the contract, right? So, Freme's contract that he writes for God is always referred to, but we never see it.
Right.
But then Dennis points out that in an early draft that then he then took out or decided not to include, there actually was a contract that we got to read. But then Eisner, for various reasons, decided, not to include it and just to infer the contract.
Yeah, and I think, I can play hindsight. It's almost 2020, so I can do that. It's that point that I think that was a good idea. That I liked the contract. I thought it was interesting. It was fascinating, but it was almost like a little, I don't know. I just got this idea that this guy out kind of in the wilderness of Europe suddenly had legal skills, and he had a whole legal vocabulary, and he wrote up a very formal contract. That contract was, I think it's like ironclad, and it would hold up in any court of law. So I get why he feels so much affront after the contract is broken, because it seems like he had some native lawyering skills.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Dennis Kitchen mentions in that essay in volume 1 is that it's a good thing that he didn't include the actual contract, because when Freme makes the contract, he's 10 years old.
Right.
And it seems a little incredulous that he would come up with that kind of wording, growing up in a shtetl and making out that contract. So, I think the inference of the contract is actually the wisest choice. And then another thing he points out in that essay, Kitchen, is that in the pencil version that we get in Volume 1, there is, I think, one page in the third story, the Super, when we get kind of a flashback, or we get kind of inside the head of the Super Scugs, not a very attractive name.
Oh, no.
But, he's kind of like a Dickensian character in terms of his name.
He's not a very attractive man.
Exactly, at all, and physically as well as, in temperament. But we see a little bit of his past, and we visually experience him as a Nazi, or as a German soldier.
Yes.
And Eisner chose to cut that in the final version because I think Scugs and his anti-Semitism and his potential Nazi links are inferred.
Sure.
So why be overt about it? Just make reference to it, because he does mention something about how things in Germany were different.
Right.
And so I think readers can put two and two together.
In Germany, it's one of those touches about I just, one of the things I love about the dialogue. It's almost like those old Katzenjammer Kids comics where, it's phonetic, and there's like this pidgin English, and it's all throughout the book. And I don't know, I love seeing that kind of thing, that kind of language in there. It's, I don't know, it's a little bit more, earthy, or seems a little more realistic.
Yeah, and we have some of the same language handlings in the final story, Kukelein, as well. But instead of having, let's say, German inflections, it's Yiddish.
I'm glad you said that, because every time I look at that, I think Cook Alien. I just think Cook Alien the whole time. So Kukelein.
Kukelein, yeah.
Kukelein.
Yeah. Now, for those who don't know about the four stories that make up A Contract with God, well, I think shame on you. This is a classic. You should know it, listeners. If you've been listening to the Comics Alternative for any length of time, it is imperative that if you haven't read it yet, run out and get a copy and read it. But it's called mistakenly the first graphic novel to go by that name. And, Eisner does call the book a graphic novel, and he thought that he was coming up with an original name for this new form of comic storytelling. Technically, it's not a novel. In other words, not a single long-form story that makes up the entire volume, but it's a collection of four different stories: A Contract with God, The Street Singer, The Super, and Kukelein. I think that, and most people refer to it as a collection of stories. And this is one of the things I've written about in the past when I've done scholarship on Eisner. I call this a graphic cycle. And listeners of the show have heard me talk about this almost ad infinitum, that it is the comics equivalent of what in prose fiction is typically called a short story cycle, or a composite novel sometime, where you have individual stories in a collection that each could stand on its own just fine, but each is linked with the other stories within the collection in such a way that bringing all of them together creates more of a whole than if you had the individual stories by themselves. And so stories like this, in terms of, let's say, prose, short story cycles, could be linked by character. In other words, you could have the same character interwoven throughout. And a great example of that is Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time, with the character Nick Adams, the protagonist. Or you could have location as a binding element of a short story cycle. And a great example, I think a classic example of that, is Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
And then there are other ways of linking stories as well. It could be through imagery. It can also be through theme. But the thing about theme is you have to be careful with that, because every author has her or his own themes that they keep coming back to again and again and again among books and their even individual stories. So, I don't know, with me in a short story cycle, there has to be something much more solid and tangible that I think weaves all of the stories together. Now, the comics equivalent of this is what I call a graphic cycle, is exactly what we have in A Contract with God, because all three of these stories take place primarily at 55 Dropsy Avenue, a tenement house. And in fact, the subtitle of A Contract with God is, Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories. Another thing that kind of binds all of these stories together, and I won't go into detail here, people can refer to an essay that I wrote several years ago on A Contract with God. There's a variety of imagery that links a variety of these stories. Characters in particular situations are very similar across these four stories. And even the way the four stories are set up, we start with A Contract with God, we end with Cuckooline. Those two stories are interlinked in a variety of different ways. And then the Street Singer and the Super that come in the middle, they are interlinked in certain ways, in other ways as well. So, this is, I think, an outstanding example, A Contract with God, of a graphic cycle. Definitely not a novel, but it is mistakenly called a graphic novel. And again, one of the reasons why, as many listeners, again, are tired of me saying, I'm sure, I do not like the designation graphic novel for a variety of reasons.
Well, the man was trying to sell the thing, Derek.
Yeah, I know. I know. And, it does come across as literary. And one of the things we get from, let's say, both Dave Gibbons's and Dennis Kitchen's essays is this sense that Eisner wanted this to be something that was carried in bookstores, that was not placed in the cartoon section, let's say, of a bookshop, but that this could stand alongside such publications by authors such as Saul Bellow, Cynthia Ozick, people like that. That's where he saw this book. And so he did want some kind of serious literary quality to this. And I think, calling it a graphic novel does give it a kind of gravitas that comics doesn't.
Right. And one of the big, historically speaking, is he was trying to pitch this to publishers, and I don't remember what the number was, but it was upwards of 50 people turned him down until finally he got somebody he was friendly with that also was a publisher that took a chance on this.
Right. Baronet Press.
Right. And that was one of the essays I actually liked. I think that was the second essay that Dennis Kitchen wrote, talking about kind of the business end of it and how he kind of watched it get taken up by Baronet Press and how he swooped in after they went out of business. And he was glad about the timing just because he felt like his company had developed to the point where they could actually handle they knew what he was a fan of Eisner. He wanted to respect his work, but he didn't think he could do it justice until about the time that Baronet kind of dropped out, and then they felt like they could pick it up and really market it for the beautiful thing that it was, and the hardcover edition with the slipcases, and really made it an artifact instead of just some floppy book.
Yeah, exactly. And this is in that second essay that you mentioned, but it's also something that Dennis mentioned the last time he was on the show for Will Eisner Week. He really wanted to be the one, and Kitchen Sink be the publisher, that put out A Contract with God originally. But Will Eisner thought that Kitchen Sink Press was a little too, how shall we say, rustic for where he wanted to go. And he wanted something that was more like a prestigious New York publisher. Although, as Kitchen points out in that second essay in Volume 2, Baronet Press didn't really come through with a high-quality product.
No. And that joke that it wasn't on Madison Avenue. It was just off Madison Avenue.
Yeah.
That made me laugh.
Yeah. But he got it in the end, and now Dennis Kitchen is a publisher along with Dark Horse of many Will Eisner penned and written texts, and also someone who works with his original art. So he works with the Eisner estate. So I guess for Dennis Kitchen, all's well that ends well, right?
That's it, and Eisner too, because he finally got that big time publisher at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, not only has Will Eisner been published by Kitchen Sink Press, Baronet Press, and DC, but now all of his work, let's say post-Spirit, right? So, beginning with Contract with God on, the latter part of his career, where he really took off in terms of a graphic novelist. Those volumes are now published by W.W. Norton.
Right.
Quite prestigious. And I remember several years ago, I guess back in around the mid 2000s, when Norton announced that they were going to be putting out new editions of Eisner's various books, from Contract with God in 78 forward. I was impressed. And not only do we have, let's say, individual paperback editions of things like, Contract with God, To the Heart of the Storm, A Life Force, and things of that sort, but we have these nice hardbound editions of, I think, collections. So, for instance, I think the first one that they put out was a Contract with God trilogy, which included A Contract with God, A Life Force, and then Dropsy Avenue. And then there were his New York stories that were published in a volume. And then there was a third one. What was that? Life Stories.
Life Stories, yes. Yeah.
So, you can get a variety of different types or volumes of Will Eisner through W.W. Norton, and they've done an incredible job.
Yeah, and I have several of those editions, and they're beautiful. They're on nice paper, and like you said, they're nice and hardback and beautiful covers, and they just look really nice on the shelf and really nice in front of you.
Yeah, exactly. Tell me about your experiences with A Contract with God. You said you've read it a number of times. Have you ever taught it?
I've never taught it. It's one of those books that I think about doing because I teach a graphic novel class, and usually the historical, I'm doing air quotes, which doesn't really work on a podcast, but
audio one, no.
Yeah. Usually I think that I give it to the students. I usually give them a choice, and they usually want to read Mouse as the kind of the landmark early, like, good graphic novel or acceptable graphic novel. So we usually start with, or if we don't start with, it's usually one of the first ones we read. Personally, I read this in high school. I remember being in high school and reading it, and I won't say that I got everything out of it that I did in multiple other readings. I knew it wasn't a typical comic book. And at the time there was a reprint of the Jungle Book, the
Harvey Kurtzman
one.
Yeah.
There was one that I'd bought because I loved Mad Magazine, and I knew I was into comics. And I think did Kitchen Sinks put out that one? It hadn't been in print in about 30 years at that point.
Yeah, they started the Kurtzman library along with Dark Horse a few years ago, and I think they started off with Jungle Book.
And so I bought that, and there was a lot. I don't know. It just had like a similar type flavor to me for some. A very different narratively speaking, but just the way they were conceived and looked. That's a book I thought about a lot, especially with the pencil pages on this go around. Just the way that
with the Curator's collection?
A lot. Yeah, in the Curator's collection, I thought a lot about Kurtzman and just the way the things are laid out, especially at the beginning of the Contract with God story, with all those dark pages and kind of all the hatching and the walking through the rain. And I kept thinking about those Kurtzman jungle, like the combat stories, like the old EC stories, like just composition wise, and the kind of, Eisner obviously adds a degree of polish to it that Kurtzman kind of leaves his raw and rough like that. So there's a part of me that actually kind of appreciated reading through this because I felt like, I don't know, like that Kurtzman stuff was underneath all the polished final product that I'm used to seeing. Because when I got to the inked book, I was like, oh, these are familiar. And there's lots of iconic images. That's one of the things, even as a kid reading through this, that picture of the rabbi kind of like raging against the storm, raging against God. Like that sticks in my head.
Fremy?
Yes. Yeah. Fremy. And there's a lot of other some of it, I was a teenager, and like the Singer story and the Cook-a-line story have, there's nudity. And as 16, we didn't have the internet. And it was one of those like, hey, there's a little bit of a butt or there's a little bit of a boot. I was very, it was stimulating in a way for me, which is a horrible thing to it. Welcome to the show, Sturge. Let's talk about boobs and butts. But these are things that, I mean, as a young guy, they like coming back at them. They just kind of, I don't know. There's a visual, the way that Eisner depicts all these things. They leave impressions. Mm-hmm. I think that's what I'm trying to get at in a not being prurient wet manner. I mean, just the imagery it's striking and it's iconic, and it really is something that makes impressions. And it's one of those things that this time going through, I really thought about it because I've read it. I read it then. I read it when I got these new Norton editions. And I've read it probably one or two times in between because it's one of those books that there's a lot of editions of it. And I've bought it multiple times just because I thought, it's something I've enjoyed reading and I like to get different versions of it. But one of the things that really stood out to me, it's kind of like, I know it's not superhero comics, but it's kind of got the bombastic nature of superhero comics to it. Mm. And it's I forget who the artist was. There's a book I read. This is helpful. There's a book I read once that had I remember there was a French artist drawing basically a parody of Kirby. And it was, I think it was a comic about a guy putting on like his boxer shorts, but he was doing it in Kirby poses. So everything and I think he was trying to say these American artists I shouldn't do a French accent. I'm not mocking. But he was trying to say like these American artists, like they have no nuance. Like everything is ultra muscular and too, bombastic. So something mundane, like a guy putting on his boxer shorts looks like, he's wrestling a lion, on the halls of Olympus or something like that. And this is not exactly that level of volume, but there's a lot of histrionics to the acting in here. Mm-hmm. The way that people, and I don't mean it in a negative way. It's just the emotions are dialed up. Like there's not, Eisner did not half step on the emoting on anybody, right? In these stories,
I'm glad that you mentioned that because it reminds me of something in one of his books, non-narrative texts, Comics and Sequential Art, Principles and Practices from the Legendary Cartoonist, where he talks about the importance of stereotypes and stereotyping for a cartoonist, and not stereotype necessarily in the way that we usually think about it, usually in a negative way. What Eisner meant was certain visuals that we come to expect that become shortcuts for reading character. And I think part of that is not only, let's say, facial features or even body shape, but also what you were describing, Sturge, and that is body movement. And so some of his characters do come across, or could, I think, come across as overdramatic. But again, it was intentionally overdramatic because of the message and, I guess, the character that Eisner was trying to get across.
Mm-hmm. And it's another thing I'm thinking of. I read Back Issue Magazine a lot, which it comes out from Tomorrow's Press. And they talk about comics in the 70s and 80s, mostly Bronze Age kinds of things. And I remember an article, somebody talking about, I think it was Steve Rude, talking about critiques he got from Alex Toth. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of this notion, I think, that you're talking about. It brings it to my mind. His Toth was kind of critiquing Steve Rude for drawing his figures kind of crouching, or so that you couldn't see their faces, or that you couldn't really get like their, it was like, I think he was talking about Nexus. So you couldn't see the symbols and all the things. And his point was, if you're going to do something that's like a superhero comic, if you're going to use the icons, you better give the people what they paid for and put the icon up big and strong so that they can clearly identify what it is. Like they put down their nickel and they want to see their people. They want to see them, with strong emotions. They want to see them with power. They want to see them with verve. And that was kind of a thing I thought of, like a similar kind of maybe intention behind this book. Like, these people, none of them are shrinking violets. They're all, Scruggs is kind of like a filthy person, and he is the filthiest person, with the thing that stands out with me is the way his face is always drawn. I mean, he's got no lips and he's like drooling, and it's like, there's just this this horrible liquid coming out. Like his face is not a face. It's kind of like this, it's like an octopus that got stepped on or something. And it's just oozing stuff all the time. And he's just lascivious and a disgusting person all around, although he's nice to his dog. So, that's his one redeeming quality is that, he likes Bruno.
Yeah. And since you were mentioning the story, The Super, one of the things that I've always found fascinating is that as the story begins and we see Scuggs's relationship with the tenants, I mean, he obviously comes across as the big bad, but by the time we get to the end of the story, things have turned and it's Rosie Farfel who seems to be the heartless individual. Because with the Super, at least he shows some kind of attachment and emotion to his dog. Right. I mean, maybe not to people, which is not a good thing, but at least to his dog. Rosie, on the other hand, God,
she's a little monster.
She's cold.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And that's. I mean, she's just waiting to grow up and be Pajel.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the essayists, I can't remember who, mentions this. Is it Dennis Kitchen or is it Dave Gibbons? One of them had written this, that they can imagine Rosie growing up years later to become one of the femme fatales that the spirit confronts. But
I think it was the Dave Gibbons one. That's what that sounds more right to me.
Yeah. It's interesting now that we're talking about the Super. Of the 4 stories, interconnected as they are, that make up A Contract with God, the book, I think the one I've always thought was not the weakest, I don't want to put it that way, but the one that, okay, at least from my perspective, impacts me the least is The Street Singer.
Yeah, I could see that. It's kind of a weird dated thing. I mean, there's not people that, I mean, I don't know about that. I've lived in big cities. I've never known, people to hang out in alleys and sing and get money thrown at them.
Yeah. Well, actually, this takes place during the 1930s, right? So we're in the midst of a depression. And so people do what they can to earn even just a few cents. And so what the protagonist, and in fact, we don't know his real name, if I'm not mistaken. The woman, Diva Marta Marias, the old opera singer who wants to make something of the street singer, names him Ronald Barry. And, that does sound rather striking. And, but we don't know his name. We know that he's an accountant, he's a drunk, and he doesn't really treat his wife and child very well at all. And that's putting it lightly. But, it's an interesting story, and it ends with, almost an O. Henry-esque twist at the end.
Right.
And so, I like it well enough. I just don't think it's the strongest by far of the 4 in the collection. Super, on the other hand, I really like. I think, as much as I like the story A Contract with God, I have to say that Kugelein is probably my favorite of the 4 because I think it is the most complex.
Well, it's got the most characters kind of dancing around in it too. So you got multiple storylines in that I think it's interesting. I like it. I know this isn't fair, but I can't read it and not think of Dirty Dancing. Which
it's kind of sad that that's the case, isn't it?
I mean, my sister watched a lot of Dirty Dancing growing up, so it's in there, and it is kind of sad because I think I like the story. And I agree with you. I mean, it's got nuance to it. I don't know. There's something about, I don't know, the romances in it are a little bit, not all of the romances. I mean, I think the main story that, like the young people going down to, go to the Catskills and get married up, everyone's looking for a rich person basically.
Right.
To pair up with. And there's a little bit, I mean, it's not sitcom-ish, but it does strike me like a little bit of a, it's like a meet cute kind of, I mean, this is not cute though. The meeting is not cute, the circumstances, but it does have that. And I'm not saying this to discount the story because I like that one too. And I was going through it as a kid, like my first impressions. I think that was my least favorite story when I was younger, and reading it through it this time, I think I agree with you about the singer being the weakest, but to me, it's kind of like the characters are not, they're not the most nuanced. Like Skuggs is a despicable person, but he's got that one piece to him. And that, the little girl whose name I can't remember is, she looks cute, and,
Rosie?
you think Rosie, you think she's innocent, and then she's like a Venus flytrap or something. Like it's horrible. And the Cuchulainn story, I really like. I like a lot of the ancillary characters, I think, much more. And I think the relationships are very nuanced. I'm flipping through right now, and I'm trying to find, that the married couple. And
you're talking about not Willie's parents, but the I can't remember the guy's name, but the guy who hitches a ride with Sam when he goes up to the Cuchulainn because he wants to catch his wife in the act of being with other people.
Yeah, they're an interesting couple, them.
Yeah.
To make, kind of how their relationship goes, which I thought that was very interesting. What's that? No, that's sorry. I'm flipping through this thing trying to figure it out. I like that. I mean, the kids being interdicted is kind of interesting too. Talking about, like they're experimenting, they're looking at things, and it's like innocent and not innocent. Mm-hmm. Which I think is interesting, and how all these things are juxtaposed. Right. Irving. It's Irving and the other one.
Yeah. Irving is the husband who goes up to see his wife Marilyn and finds Marilyn with, the 15-year-old Willie. And
right.
So in essence, here's this older woman, married woman, Marilyn, who is in the act of statutory rape,
right?
Legally, and. One of the things that I was reminded of in going back and rereading these various stories in A Contract with God, the pencil and the ink versions, is how harsh, so to speak, Cuchulainn actually is. Because, we mentioned, Marilyn and, her being with the 15-year-old Willie, but we also have, the young man Benny, who is trying to find someone rich that he can hook up with, and Goldie is attempting to do the same. And so both of them are putting on a charade of being someone that they're not. And once each of them discovers that, they're just, working folk,
right.
with not rich and not from a rich family, then Benny thinks that he has the right then to basically take Goldie, and he rapes her.
Right. Yeah.
And at the same time, you have Willie's younger brother, and I can't remember her name. Hilda, the young girl, and they're seeing each other's crotch. She grabs his pee-pee, as he calls it, and he talks about having nothing more than a hole.
Right.
And then they go and they actually witness this rape where Benny forces himself on Goldie, and I mean this is not light stuff.
No, it's not. And it's kids seeing it too, which is, Hilda and, is it Benny? Benny. Yeah. Not Benny. Petey. Yep. Petey. So but but they have it. I mean, they know what's going on, but they're also sort of innocent too. I mean, it's an interesting thing because you talk about with the thematics, because you talk about Rosie, who looks innocent and is horrible. And then you got these guys who are, ostensibly innocent, but they're curious. They're looking at things. They're going to go out and look at the world and see how things go. You want to watch the grown-ups doing dirty things? Yeah, if we don't get in trouble. So, it's like a Twisted Little Rascals cartoon or something like that.
Yeah, and with the versions of A Contract with God that we have in these two volumes, in the Curator's collection, both the pencils and the ink, the very last story, Cuchulainn, and I want to comment on this just briefly. The last page of Cuchulainn ends with Willie on the fire escape looking down at the city, and his mother is inside saying, Willie, start getting ready for school. It starts next week. This year, right. You're going to have lots of responsibility around here. Your father's going to be traveling a lot, so you'll be the man of the house now. That's how it ends. One of the things that I really appreciated about that Norton edition that came out a number of years ago is they included extra art that Eisner, obviously before he died, wanted to include in these newer editions. And if you recall, Sturge, the very last image of A Contract with God, the final story in Cuchulainn, is, again, Willie on the balcony, but instead of seeing him from, let's say, an angled front shot, we see him from behind. And so the visual is the back of Willie as he's looking out at the city. And there's something contemplative and pensive about that. And we get the sense that Willie, who, is an obvious autobiographical link to Will Eisner, is looking out on the city. And it's almost as if you have the artist creator looking at the inspiration for the kind of writing that he would do later, like with A Contract with God, like Dropsy Avenue, like A Life Force, is that the city is a source of inspiration, this neighborhood in particular. And I really did appreciate that. Now, we don't get these, additional images, of course, in the Curator's edition.
There's a little bit of that. Well, he's on a fire escape. It's on page 401 on the PDF. It's like a little, what is this? Cover to the softcover edition? No, it's a front piece, I think.
Yes. Okay, so with the John Lind essay?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's with that one.
Yeah, and in fact,
it's tiny though.
Yes.
In comparison.
It is, and it does say that it's Cuchulainn final chapter page from A Contract with God trilogy, that Norton edition. So, I mean, I said that they obviously wouldn't be in the Curator's edition because, again, we're dealing with the originals. But this page that we see here, the one that I just described of Willie from behind looking out at the city, was something that Eisner created later.
Gotcha.
That was included in the Norton edition. And, he did that with some of the other stories as well. But I think that with the Cuchulainn story, it was the most striking.
And I don't know what to make of this. There is a little bit of spirit in that last page. Like the way Willie looks. He looks a little bit like Denny Colt.
Yeah.
No mask, but
in the original ending page.
Yes, the original ending.
Right.
I also like to see the little end note that's, apparently there were too many ahs or ers. Somebody put in pen, it reads too fast. Take that out of there. There were two ers. Yeah, I like seeing that stuff because it's like writing. You see the final product and it looks beautiful and you don't see all the drafts. And this, it's like you see all the little ellipsis and where things should be and there's whiteout.
Yeah, and again, one of the benefits of these kind of editions, this is the Curator's edition or Curator's collection, like an artist edition. These are the kind of things that we see, that every now and again there'll be notes on there from someone, whether it be an editor or whoever.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by stuff like that. I love seeing original art pages that are all marked up and annotated and things like that.
Yeah, on the previous page, someone had written spell to the side. That's really interesting. And again, one of the joys of looking at volumes like this, where you find the original art, whether it be in pencils or ink, and you can see, again, kind of the process. We were talking about being process junkies, how it started, how it ended up, and what are some of the changes that were made along the way. What are some, even the mistakes? And as Dennis Kitchen points out at one point, even some of the minor typos found their way in the final version.
Well, it's tough to read all these words. I mean, all these phonetic spellings. You could just say, they just talk that way.
Yeah. So, I really enjoyed this. And this is something that I know that when Paul was co-hosting with me, he and I had talked about discussing on an earlier episode, but we never got around to it. And so that's one of the reasons why I wanted you and I to discuss this. You have a lot of experience with A Contract with God. This Curator's edition is just fascinating.
It's beautiful. The only thing I have to say is that I'm a little bit jealous that you have the hard copy.
Yeah.
And how big? I know the artist editions they're huge.
Yeah.
How big is this book? Is this?
This is a little larger than you would think. And in fact, I'm looking on Amazon now, and it does give the dimensions. This is 11.2 by 3 by 15.4 inches. So it's large, but not near as large as some of the IDW artist editions. And from what I understand, the art that we get in the hard copy of the Curator's collection is the size that Eisner was actually working with, which is similar to what you get with the IDW artist editions, which is one of the reasons why it's so big. Right. But I can't remember if it was Dennis Kitchen or someone else who said in one of their original essays for this Curator's collection that Eisner wrote in a format that was just a tad bigger than the final product, which is different from a lot of comics creators who wrote much larger.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, we get those big artist editions.
Wow. Okay. Well, yeah. Like I said, I'm just impressed with this. I love the ink page, the version, but the pencil version is just. I'm super impressed by just the level of detail, his lettering, even just his slapdash lettering is phenomenal. Mm-hmm. So. Which is, I know people tune into podcasts to listen to about how the lettering looks, but it's all part of the product.
Well, Sturge, do you want to move on to the second title that we're discussing this week?
Sure. Is that Egg Cream number 1?
Egg Cream number 1 by Liz Suburbia. And this is, the digital version is out now, but the hard copy version of Egg Cream will not be coming out until, I guess it's going to be debuting next year at MoCCA. And that will be in April of 2019. And this, at least that's what Kevin Czap told me when I saw him at Small Press Expo this past weekend. And this is coming out from Czap Books. And I got a copy of this just, I think, last week because I had backed Czap Books. They had a Kickstarter at some point last year, and Egg Cream number 1 was part of the package. And I think it's coming out, or at least the digital, a little later than anticipated, I think. And I asked Kevin, I said, well, if the hardcover's not coming out until April, should we wait and discuss it? He said, no, the digital is out now, so you guys can go ahead and discuss it. He said, I'd like for you to. So thus, we're discussing Egg Cream number 1 by Liz Suburbia, out from Czap Books. And for those who may not be familiar, Liz Suburbia is the author of a book that came out in 2015 called Sacred Heart. And Sturge, both you and I have read that.
Mm-hmm. What's more, I've taught it. I've taught Sacred Heart.
Oh, really? How did you approach it? I'm curious.
Well, interestingly enough, it was the first time I taught my graphic novel course, which is maybe 2-3 years ago at this point. And at the time, I was not aware that Sacred Heart had a hard copy version, and we were searching to find a webcomic to read commonly. And that's the book that we picked. So we read the online version first, not knowing that there was a hard copy, and it ends. If you've seen what's online, it ends rather abruptly. It actually ends about, I would say, halfway through what the print book ends up being. Mm-hmm. So it left us up in the air, and we had a lot of questions about, narrative closure and things like that, because we were like, what kind of story is this that just
and also
does
the
this?
Art online is significantly different from the printed version.
Yes, it's extensive revision. And then when I found out it was a book, I got my hands on the book and shared it with the class, and we had a whole different discussion about, it how it ends. And if we're talking about this version, it's obviously can we spoil the ending
of the first Sacred Heart? Well, it's been out for 3 years, so.
Okay. And plus, this book is based on that. There's a flood and a tragedy and a natural disaster that engulfs this town. Mm-hmm. And this version is about, that came out of nowhere. Like, we did not know that was happening because there's no sign of that happening. And then it just kind of happens in the last, 5 to 10 pages. And so it radically changes the narrative. That's what I remember talking about with the class, because it's kind of like this weird teenager story where there are no adults and the teenagers are kind of just running this town. So a lot of people are like, why is this happening? And there's no indication of why this is happening in that book. And then just kind of this flood happens and people die.
Yeah, and you're going, what?
Yeah, exactly. Like, where did this come from? It's like literally like the hand of God just came in and smote things, which might be, I mean, it's called Sacred Heart. There's clearly a lot of, in this book, revelations about religious, the cults and things like that led to that situation happening at the time. And so this is kind of like the backstory, but told 10 years later, which I thought was really interesting. There was it's like I tried looking for my copy and I couldn't find it. So I was just going by memory. And so I was it took me a little bit to kind of recall what had happened and then to kind of catch up. And then there's that added layer of, I'm trying to remember who the characters are because they look different because they're 10 years older. Yeah. So there's, they're depicted differently. The one, the lead singer of the rock group, I recognized her right off the bat. I was like, oh yeah, she's very distinctive. She's just got different hair. But yeah, it was. Yeah.
And that's, oh God, what's her name? Oh, Jenna Victor.
Yes, Jenna. So I was really looking forward to this when I didn't even know this thing existed. And then when you said, hey, let's read that, I thought, I'm down. I'm like sign me up right now.
So, and we're talking about Egg Cream #1 within the context of Sacred Heart, which came out, again, 3 years ago in 2015. I don't think that someone has to have read Sacred Heart at all, either the online version or even the print version, in order to pick up Egg Cream #1 and get into it and appreciate it. I think that, or at least with this first issue of Egg Cream, it could stand on its own. I do think it benefits by knowing what goes on with that first book, Sacred Heart, because this Egg Cream #1 is, I guess, the comic series, and it's made up not just of this story, right? Because there are other things that are going on. There's a collection of Liz Suburbia's dreams. And what's that section called? Something like Dog Dreams? Dog Dreams.
What a Dog Dreams.
What a Dog Dreams. And so she illustrates some dreams, apparently, that she's had. And then there's some other things in there, too. But the heart, so to speak, of Egg Cream #1 is Sacred Heart Volume 2. And so this story is called, I guess, the second volume, Livin in the Future. And what I guess is that with subsequent issues of Egg Cream, we'll get further installments of this second volume of Sacred Heart. And so and I agree with you, the ending of the 2015 Sacred Heart could be a little head-scratching. This does fill in a lot of those gaps. And the vast majority of this first installment of Sacred Hearts Volume 2, Livin in the Future, is told through a documentary. And in fact, we know that some people are in some kind of establishment, a bar, because, one of the first panels, we see a neon sign that says bar. And we actually see, the inside of the bar. And someone mentioned something about turning on the TV and it's about to come on. And then they flip channels and then they find this documentary. And the documentary is based on, in essence, kind of where we left off with that 2015 Sacred Heart. And it's about the cult of Alexander the Lesser, the Church of Alexander the Lesser, and how, I guess more recently, a lot of the adults who were following him had some kind of confrontation with the law, ended up jumping off the bridge, and in essence committed suicide. And this is not a spoiler in any way, because we get this at the very beginning. But then we get in this documentary that the people at the bar are watching, the input and the experiences and the history of what happened through the survivors of Alexandria. And so this takes us back to the original 2015 Sacred Heart, where you have kids on their own living without adults. Because in Sacred Heart, in the earlier book, it's never really explained much at all. Why are these kids doing their own thing and why are there no adults? Now, we find this out in this first Egg Cream installment. And
that's what I recall about reading it the first time with my class, is that as we went through it, it was one of those books that about halfway through, I mean, there's there's kids doing things, they're drinking, they're, carousing, and there's also a murderer going around stalking people. And I think about halfway through the book, we all kind of just looked at each other in our discussion and just thought, why aren't there no adult? Like it was like some kind of sudden realization, like we're reading this book about these kids doing these things and where are the adults? Mm-hmm. And it was kind of shocking. And to kind of think about that, because I think it just added a layer of mysteriousness to it. This is some kind of almost future dystopia story. At the time, maybe we thought, that was more like the currency at the time. So we're like, is that what this is? Is this some kind of end of the world narrative? And these kids are just kind of living in a town, which made the flood even more distressing. Cause it's like, okay, this is the last of civilization. And now they're all drowning. Which, yeah, it was an interesting time talking about it. And one of the things too that you brought up, I thought was clever about this, is the setup about using that device of watching the documentary to kind of fill things in and provide story. And I really liked how it's almost like Mystery Science Theater. There's these little word balloons that come from off panel that are saying, hey, they're commenting. And when you get to the documentary, when it starts with part 2, which I thought was like a cheeky little way to talk about this. Cause it's like, do you have to read part 1? And that's did you watch part 1? Nah, but what? Shh, that's the dialogue. Don't worry about part 1. Just dial in here.
And that's almost, I'm not saying it's an intentional metafictional or self-reflexive moment, but that gets back to the question or the issue that you and I raised a moment ago. Do you need to read the 2015 Sacred Heart in order to appreciate this second volume that we see in Egg Cream #1? I don't think you do.
Yeah, I think for me personally, not having it fresh in my head, it kind of detracted from my experience, because I kept trying to be like, do I know this person? What was that person's backstory? Why, instead of actually getting involved with the narrative, instead of, trying to guess or remember who everybody had been, mm-hmm. which isn't going to matter much in some sense, because this is 10 years later. So they're not the same people at this point.
Right. Now, in again, the 2015 book, Sacred Heart, and the webcomic, as you mentioned, our protagonist is a young woman who goes by the name of Ben. Mm-hmm. And at the end of this first installment of Sacred Heart Volume 2, in Egg Cream #1, mm-hmm. I guess at the last part of that documentary that at least we see in the comic, one of the people who shares their story, and we don't see her until the very end, is someone whose name is B. Naomi Schiller. And right. So this is B, I guess, for Ben, or whatever her actual name is. Naomi Schiller is, I guess, the protagonist that we had in that earlier book, but she looks quite a bit different. But as you point out, this is years later after the events take place. And so, of course, she's going to look different. And then someone who's actually sitting in the bar watching this documentary on the TV says, hey, that's you. And so at the end of this first installment of Sacred Heart Volume 2, we pull back from the documentary and we're taken, I guess, more into current time, because some guy says, again, hey, that's you on the TV. That's you, isn't it? And then she looks at him. She turns around and says, yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. And then he asks if he can buy her a drink, and she says, sure. And that's, in essence, how this first part of the second volume ends. So I liked the way that this story was structured. I liked some of the other material that we have, like, for instance, What a Dog Dreams. But again, the heart of this first issue of Egg Cream is, the first part of Sacred Heart Volume 2, Living in the Future.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like you were talking about. I do listen to the podcast, even if I'm on the podcast. I was listening to the episode that you just put up about Heroes, talking about the new Dreaming comics and how, what you look for in a #1, just enough to kind of a great premise, something intriguing, something mysterious, something that'll hook you and want you to come back and wonder if, there's something, what's going to develop from this, like the potential. And I do think that's what I see here. Like, it's not the finished narrative. And, it's one of those things that I think in this day and age, when so often, we can get our hands on a complete graphic novel or a trade paperback, and you read the entire, you get some narrative structure, you get a little bit of closure. Sometimes it's hard to forget or hard to remember what it's like to read serially, to not know, okay, how's this going to resolve?
Yeah, and I get the impression that Egg Cream is going to be something like, let's say, Optic Nerve, Adrian Tomini's Optic Nerve, in that it's made up of different stories or different segments. Right. And so I guess with future issues of Egg Cream, we'll see the same thing. Again, a continuation of this second volume of Sacred Heart, and then additional stories and art as well. So.
Yeah, and that was a neat thing. I mean, I did enjoy the dream sequence at the end, or the dream sequences. I mean, it was one of those things that I was wondering, because it's an intriguing title, and I was like, oh, but I'm a little literal sometimes, and I was like, where are the dogs? I was promised a dog in the title. Where is the dog? But it's interesting. I'm always fascinated by these things. I think about those Rick Veitch comics that he did, all his dream with those Rare Bit Fiend books.
Oh yeah,
the 90s with all, and they got very strange. But hers are very idiosyncratic, and there's a lot of pop culture references. She's married to LeBron James in one, in a very realistic manner, which I thought, and he's very kind and a giving partner, which I thought that was very. Very sweet. Yeah. She's at a rock concert with the X-Men on a boat that's sinking.
Yeah, an X-Men themed cruise ship that was both sinking and on fire.
I know, it's a metaphor, I think.
Yeah. And then she runs into her best friend, who just happens to be on board, and waves at him.
Right. Hey, this is
Strange Dreams.
It was more compelling than I thought it was going to be. Sometimes, people's dreams can go. I also read when I was in college, I read a lot of Henry Rollins' dream diaries, and there's a lot of bats and blood in those. That's what I remember. But I can give or take those. This is a lot more engaging for a non-linear narrative.
Yeah. I really liked, again, this first installment of Sacred Heart Volume 2. I thought it was compelling, and I'm really looking forward to future issues of Egg Cream. Now, I have no idea about the frequency of this title. So, for instance, when will we get Egg Cream number 2? Because it seems like it's been a long time since we... I think it was maybe a year and a half ago at least that Egg Cream number 1 was announced. So if it's taken this long for Egg Cream number 1 to come out, then do we have to wait the same length of time for issue number 2, or is issue number 2 going to be quicker coming out? I don't know. Right. But so for those who did back the Czap Books project on Kickstarter last year, then you will have access to Egg Cream number 1, and if you didn't, then you'll have to wait until spring of next year for a hard copy version. But I think it would be worth a wait.
Oh, definitely. It's a unique book. I've not read a lot of things like this, and I love the artwork, and I'm really intrigued by where it's going. Yeah.
Another thing about Liz Suburbia as a creator, in going through and looking at some interviews and reviews of the 2015 Sacred Heart, I found it curious that a number of reviewers and interviewers would contextualize or try to describe Liz Suburbia's art within the context of both, not just one, Hernandez brothers. There have been I think more times than not, her art, and I can see this, is compared to Jaime, because there is something Jaime-esque in a way about her art, maybe not as detailed as we see in Jaime's stories in his illustrations. But, there is something somewhat similar. But I've even seen where reviewers will liken her, maybe storytelling, if not art, to Gilbert.
That's interesting. I'm just paging through pages thinking about who it calls to mind. And I mean, I can see it kind of being a marriage of both brothers in a sense. It kind of looks a little bit like, it reminds me of, I can't remember her name, but Sophia Goldstein did the oven.
Yeah, Sophie
oven.
Goldstein. Yeah, I saw her this weekend at SPX.
Oh, that's awesome. Because she's got different styles that she uses, but this is similar to the style in the oven book.
Yeah, it does have this kind of, and I don't mean this in a negative way, simple, almost iconic and cartoony, if you will, look to it. And you're right. A lot of Sophie's art is like that as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense to me.
And I'm thinking, who is the minimum wage person?
Bob Fingerman.
I'm thinking a little Bob Fingerman in there too. I mean, it's punk rocky like him. And it's a little bit, it definitely is iconic. I don't know, some of the characters, there's a couple of the characters that look like Fingerman characters to me. Like on page 17, there's a professor who looks like on the PDF. I don't know who that's supposed to be. Yeah. He looks like a Fingerman dude. He does.
The way his beard looks, especially in the eyebrows, the hair, I guess, looks Fingerman-esque.
But it's no detraction to her. She's got a great style. I love it. It's very compelling, like you say. It's very iconographic. She doesn't. One of the things that I remember in Sacred Heart that I loved, that I don't see as much in this one, but there's not opportunity for it, is the way she depicted music. It was like undulations and waves. And I mean, comics try to depict things that, can't be, visually. And I just remember the concert scenes being just some of the best parts of the book for me, because they were insane. And they had this crazy line work and undulations.
Book.
The 2015 one.
Yeah.
And this one does. I mean, that's one of the things I like about her in general. I think she's creative. She's very imaginative about how she lays things out. Although some of this is very, plain. I mean, I'm looking at some of the houses. They're very, like you said, they're very iconographic. They're almost like, I'm not going to say childlike, but they're very simple, but they get the message across.
Right. And in this story, again, Sacred Heart Volume 2, this first installment, she uses a consistent 6-panel page layout, where we have basically a 2x3, 2 rows or 3 rows, 2 panels across that tell the story. And she really doesn't vary from that. I don't think.
No, I don't. I think you're right, but I think it also goes along with the whole. They're watching a documentary on TV, so it's kind of like picture.
Right. And it's interesting that you say that, because when she does disrupt that pattern, right, that structure, it's at the very end of this first installment where we go from a 6-panel page to a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, another 6-panel page in the penultimate one, but it's laid out in an entirely different way. So that first row is 2 panels, then the second row is 1 long panel, and then the third row is 3 smaller panels. And then you have another variation on the very last page where we have a row that's made up of 2 oblongish panels and then 2 tall panels beside it. Then the middle row is, again, a long oblong panel. And then that very last image, which is an unframed panel, is a jukebox that has lyrics pouring out of it.
Yeah, and I love that. That's. I mean, it's not exactly like the music at the concert, but I love that kind of undulating, I don't know, blob coming out of the jukebox with the song in it. And I don't know, there's something about that I love the way she just plays around with different senses, I guess, and making them visual. So that's one of the high points of this book for me. You want to go on to Hey Kids?
Yep, let's go to Hey Kids Comics. And we're going to be looking at the first two issues, number 1 and number 2. This is by Howard Chaykin, and it's coming out from Image Comics. Now, issue number 1 of Hey Kids Comics, and there's an exclamation mark at the end. So it's not just Hey Kids Comics. It's Hey Kids, comics. Issue number 1 came out last month, and the second issue was released as we're recording this just last week. It came out on September 12th. So yeah, we wanted to discuss this, and we've been referencing Howard Chaykin on the podcast quite a number of times over the past few years, but it's been a long time, now that I think about it, that we've actually discussed a Howard Chaykin title. Mm-hmm. So this gives us the opportunity to do so. And okay, so how would Sturge? How would you describe Hey Kids Comics?
I describe it as a look at, it's a fictionalized look at the history of comics, featuring characters who are, if they're not homages or they're not pastiches. I can talk. Greek people eat pasticcio, which is like a pastiche. It's like lasagna, but different. But it's kind of like a version of the early days of comics. I mean, there's a Joe Siegel analog. There's a Jack Kirby analog. There's, I think, Matt Baker analog. Yeah. And maybe
Stan Lee.
There's definitely a Stan Lee. And is it a Marie Severin? There's a female creator,
right? Someone like that, yeah. And
I mean, go ahead. No, and I think the cover kind of. I bought this off the rack a couple months ago when I saw it because it was Howard Chaykin, and I thought, okay, I'll get it. And the cover kind of perplexed me because I was like, what is this book?
It's a photographic cover,
right? It's a photographic cover about a like you just said, Hey Kids Comics. And then there's kind of like this meta commentary of like it's a comics creator wearing a comics T-shirt, and he's saying too many to sign. Who do you think had to carry him? So like he's at a con and he's dealing with the fans, so he's kind of maybe a little sour at the whole being asked to sign comics. And there's that kind of interesting juxtaposition of Hey Kids Comics, and then you kind of look deeper, and then he's got little buttons on his T-shirt, and one's like I grok hentai, which is definitely not kids and comics. And then if you get the cosplay, I get the stare, which is he's kind of like a sexist jerk, which kind of gets to the themes of it, I guess, to me anyway, because it's kind of an ironic. These are the good old days, except for the good old days were pretty horrible. And to me, reading this book was. I read this book the first time, and it was one of those, it jumps around a lot chronologically. So there's 3 and 4 page sequences in different decades, and they feature the same characters. And the first issue, you kind of just jump into everything. And so it's like, here's a scene, then there's another scene, then there's another scene. And the first scene, if I remember, is kind of like a Superman. It's not Superman. His name is Powerhouse. Mm-hmm. But there's a movie premiere or a play premiere, and the publisher is there on the red carpet, and this kind of vagrant person comes up and asks him for money, and it turns out it's the person who created Powerhouse, which is like the Jerry Siegel kind of analog. Yeah. And and nobody recognized that. He just gives him some money, and they're like, yeah, get rid of this guy. And she's like, who is that? And he's like, oh, that's the guy who created this.
Yeah.
Which is, a little kicker. But I don't know. It's kind of like an expose of the dark underbelly of the classic days of comics and how the good old days weren't always good. Yeah. And tomorrow isn't bad as it seems. No, I'm singing Billy Joel now. I'm sorry.
Yeah. But, you said the history of comics. We should point out comics in America, right? Because, I mean, European comics history, right. Japan's comic history, completely different. Yeah. But yeah, this
American superhero comics, pretty much.
In particular, yeah. And, your comment about jumping around, I think, is something that we can discuss a little bit. Because I went through the 2 issues, and issue number 1, and we get these timestamps, at least in terms of years.
Right.
In issue number 1, we begin in 1967, and that's the aforementioned scene at the premiere that you just described. And then we go back to 1945, then 1955, then 1965, and then 2001. Okay. And then in issue 2, we begin with 1945, then 1955, then 1965, and then 2001. So, we're, for the most part, dealing with the same time periods. And at least with these first couple of issues, there is some kind of consistency with maybe a little variation in the way that it goes from one time period to the next. Also, in the 2001 sections, both of them are, I guess, notable because of a death that takes place, right? So in issue number 1, we have some of our main characters and even minor players in this story who are attending the funeral of Alfred Kessler. And Kessler was an artist who seemed to get crapped on all the time.
Right.
And then in issue number 2, in that last section, which takes place again in 2001, it's the death that people are attending the funeral of Jess Mayberg, who was the editor-in-chief of Yankee Comics. And in fact, the 2 comic companies that we have in, again, both of these issues of Hey Kids Comics are Verve and Yankee. And Verve is the analog, as you were pointing out, of Marvel. And so their editor-in-chief, Bob Rose, is very much a Stan Lee character.
Right.
And then Yankee Comics is like DC.
Right. They even have the same insignia. It's just that classic 70s one, the circle with the 2 initials in the middle with the stars all around it.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
So, Chaykin's not being ambiguous here. No. I mean, he is doing it. And you mentioned the Baker reference. I mean, that's in the character we get, who I guess is one of the main characters, Ted Whitman, who is an African American who, along with Ray Clark, they served during World War II. They had been working in the comics industry before the war. They went off to do their duty. They come back, and they're hoping to pick up where they left off. But both of them had been working in the superhero genre. But what they're finding, and we get this in not only the 1945, but even the 1955 sections, that superheroes really don't have the cachet that they once had, right? Like right before and especially during the Second World War. And, again, that's what actually did happen in American comics history. And they're looking for, let's say, the new genre, the new formula, something that is going to be the next big hit. Another link that we get, and this is in issue 2 in the 1955 section, to what actually was happening with comics in the United States at that time, was, in issue number 2 in the 1955 section, there is a mentioning of horror comics being a bad influence, and congressmen kind of grandstanding in ways that, and I can't remember what the congressman is called.
I'll find him.
Yeah, Senator Cleghorn.
Cleghorn,
yeah,
that's
and
right.
He even just sounds like a Southerner, right? He's from Kentucky, just as Lefebvre was from Tennessee, I believe.
I know. I was as a adopted Tennessean now. I was like, well, at least he's not from here.
Yeah, he's from your neighbor.
That's right.
Your neighbor up north. But yeah, he is confronting a publisher named Gertz, who, really is a stand-in or an analog for Gaines. Both names start with a G. And you even see Gertz, when he's confronted by Cleghorn, sweating and kind of stammering and coming up with these questionable excuses for why something as horrific as a severed head may be appropriate for kids. In other words, it's not as bad as it could have been. And so Gertz is giving similar answers to the kind that Gaines did for the Senate committee that he had to confront. So again, there's similar things going on here. And we mentioned also earlier that the character, the editor-in-chief of Verve, Bob Rose, is definitely a Stan Lee analog, because later in his career, as we get into the 1960s and into 2001 especially, this guy becomes almost a caricature of himself. Kind of like smiling and, talking about the family. And I don't think they call it the bullpen, but he speaks in those terms.
Right. And they're pretty clear about that too, to kind of give him he's the nephew. Oh, that guy. And, just kind of like the same, nepotism that, helped Stan get where he was to kind of, this guy is definitely, uses that to his advantage. And there's the Kirby guy who's not as prominent as I thought he would be.
Sid Mitchell. Yeah.
Yeah. Cause he's a dead ringer.
He smokes a cigar all the time, and he's gruff, and he seems kind of short and stubby, solidly built. So yeah, I enjoyed these 2 issues of Hey Kids Comics. As you pointed out, there are a lot of characters and there's a lot of jumping around across time, especially in that first issue. And I have to say that with the first issue, I felt a little confused and I didn't know exactly where Chaykin was going. I felt that with issue number 2, there was a little more grounding. And one of the things that helped in issue number 2 was on the very first page, we get a list of the main and even minor characters, right? So we get not only a description of who these characters are. So for instance, Ray Clark, freelancer who signs on with anyone who will have him, maintains similar approach in his romantic life. And we see pictures of him from, let's say, the 1940s, him in 1955, in 1965, and then 2001. And so if you were confused who certain characters were, that these people across the various pages were the same person, just aging and with different colored hair or less hair, these people are Ray Clark, the same person. Same thing with Ted Whitman, right? So I think that the description of these characters and their relationship and their images in this second issue, that was really helpful. I can see why he didn't include this in issue number 1, though.
Sure. And then he was laying the groundwork, and it's one of the things that, you mentioned not having reviewed a Chaykin book in a while on the podcast, and this is one of the things that I have 2 little kids, so I have like these short boxes of comics in my downstairs that I'm one day going to get to all of them. And I recently read through the whole run of Satellite Sam, which was the Matt Fraction book. He wrote it, and Chaykin did the artwork for kind of an analog of the Superman radio show, or the Superman TV show, the George Reeves one. And that is similar in the sense of a period piece. That one was in black and white. There were multiple characters. It was really difficult to kind of keep track of everyone. And at the beginning of every issue, there was they had more characters. So there were like 10 or 12 characters, and they all had just one line descriptors, and it was set in the same time period, so they didn't age. So I think this is something that at least Chaykin's figured out helps his comics come across, that he needs to remind you who people are, just so that when you get to the narratives, it helps, at least when there's space in between it. With Satellite Sam, I found, as if I read him at a clip, I really didn't get lost. And I'm imagining, actually not even imagine, because I read these 2 issues. It was a lot easier to keep up once I kind of knew who was who. So I think this is a book that I think will benefit reading it in a trade much more than reading it individually. I think it'll be more rewarding just to kind of read it at a clip. That way you kind of don't have time to forget who's who.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I may go on to read this in single issues, but I'll probably do with Hey Kids Comics what I intend to do with Satellite Sam. Is I started reading it with individual issues, an installment at a time, but then after a while I kind of stopped getting the single issues, and I eventually got the deluxe edition that has the entire run. And so I do have that on my to-read list. I haven't gotten to it yet. And same thing with the trade of a title that I had wanted to discuss last year, but we never got around to, Divided States of Hysteria, another Image title. And, I wanted to look at that one because I was sure that it would be controversial given the topic and given that it's Howard Chaykin. And lo and behold, there were some controversial aspects of that series. But we never got around to discussing that on the podcast.
I never got around to reading it. It was something intriguing because I wanted to see what all the hubbub was about, but I never did get to it.
Yeah, in fact, now that I think about it, I think in addition to Satellite Sam, and we did have Matt Fraction on the show, and I think that's where we talked about Satellite Sam, the first 1 or 2 issues. But we did discuss Marked Man a while back, a number of years ago. Not that good. It's okay, I guess. and we discussed Black Kiss 2.
I hadn't read that yet.
Okay, well, okay.
I read the first one, but that was a while ago.
Okay, Black Kiss, the first one, I think is well worth reading. I don't know if I'd say the same about Black Kiss 2. And I remember Andy and I, if not panning it, then being less than enthusiastic. It was, I don't know, a little too much. I mean, one could argue that Black Kiss was too much of what it was, but it was intriguing and it was very different. Black Kiss 2 was just kind of a return to that and not as satisfying. But so I'm expecting some fun things from Hey Kids Comics.
I'm kind of intrigued by it too, for the same aspects I was intrigued by Satellite Sam, is kind of looking at depictions of non-dominant people in time periods where we don't often think of them existing, or at least I'm just in comics history, African American people and women creators especially are kind of on the margins of things. You think of the classic comics, or at least American superhero comics, it's the Stan Lees and the Jack Kirbys and all those types. And to me, one of the things I thought was really interesting is when Ted and Ray come back and they go looking for work, that they run into Benita Heindel, who's the woman who's suddenly picking up the slack that other people had, they'd left a vacuum, and she was one of the people that are working. And there's a comment, I think in issue 2, about basically these guys coming back and displacing the women from the jobs that they had assumed. And that's a really interesting, I mean, just in general, to kind of see how these characters are navigating these spaces where they're, on the margins is really interesting to me. In a historical kind of aspect as well.
Yeah, you're right that the character Benita Heindel becomes almost like a Rosie the Riveter of comics, right? So she steps in when the male creators are off at war, yet she's, tossed to the side once they come back, and is not appreciated for the work that she had done. So you do get to see that less attractive side of American comic book history.
And it's interesting too to see it over time. I mean, just the way that these people maintain relationships and how they remain the same and also kind of evolve slightly. I'm intrigued to see kind of how these things play out. And there's a part of me, I'm a sucker for fake covers. I love the whole the horror comics. I mean, they're all like these fake EC covers that aren't authentic, and then if you don't get that he's Stan Lee, I mean, it's Tarantulas. It's like, ooh, is that Spider-Man? The Cosmos Quartet, and those kinds of things. And, some of the, Bob Rose, the Verve creator, makes cool comics cool again, not just for kids. I mean, it just screams like, hi, that's Stan.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, I think this is definitely something worth checking out. Now, I don't know, or if people haven't read them yet, do you know how many issues Hey Kids Comics will be? I'm assuming that it's a limited series, and I can't remember from the original solicit.
And I don't remember that either. I mean, Chaykin tends to have an endpoint in mind. I mean, that's usually his MO of late. I'm going to guess 12 issues. That's going to be my guess.
Wow, 12. I would have said something like 6, but who knows?
Hey, there's a lot of history in these pages.
That's true.
I don't know. I just want covers. I just want bulletins. I don't know. They're the X-Men, but they evolve in their teenagers.
Yeah.
And Sea Sultan, Marionette. That's the Submariner there. That looks awesome. I just want a whole issue of these.
Yeah.
Kind of like those 1963 comics that they imaged in a few years ago.
Sturge, this has been your debut or your maiden voyage, however you want to describe it. And I think that it was a really good episode for you to jump into the Comics Alternative, because we looked at 3 very different titles. We started off with a Contract with God Curators collection, which was edited and designed by John Lynn, coming out from Dark Horse and Kitchen Sink Press. And then after that, we looked at Egg Cream #1 by Liz Suburbia from Czap Books. And the hard copy won't come out until the spring. But for those who back the Kickstarter, hey, you got the digital version of it. And then we wrapped up by looking at the first two issues of Howard Chaykin's Hey Kids comics from Image.
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks for a smooth maiden voyage. I did better than the Titanic, so I'm counting it in the win column.
And, I look forward to talking with you about a variety of other comics in the weeks to come. And if you want to find great titles like the kind that we were discussing on this episode, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. And as Sturge pointed out at the top of the show, if you go there right now, you can find the Contract with God Curators collection at 40% off of the cover price. Now, it's still $117, but hey, that beats $190-some, right? So
definitely.
That's a really good discount. You can also find 40% off of issue number 4 of Hey Kids comics. You really can't beat the prices. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with us and let us know how Sturge did on his very first episode. And be gentle, please.
Please be gentle.
Yeah, we want him to stick around, right? If you want to go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Pick up your telephone or your cell phone. It could be a landline, doesn't matter. And dial 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can email us at twoguys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can email me at Sturge@comicsalternative.com.
Or me at Derek@comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. Check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Google Podcasts, on TuneIn, and on iHeartRadio. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on the blog occasionally, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com.
Sounds good to me, Derek.
Sturge, glad that you're a part of the Comics Alternative, and I do very much look forward to talking with you about other titles in the weeks to come.
Hey, I'm looking forward to talking to you, too.
Yes.
About everything.
Yeah. And we will be back next week with more fun stuff. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Sturge.
Take care.
See ya.